Good afternoon and welcome to That Escalated Quickly, a resilience podcast. My name's Simon Petie. I'm joined this afternoon by Will Hetherington, one of our senior managers at Escalate. G'day, Will.
G'day, Simon. Thanks very much for having me.
Mate, today the podcast is based around leadership in disruption. And as not just a senior manager for us, but someone who has worked across business, supporting leaders and being a leader yourself, when we talk about crisis management, business continuity, why can't everybody do this? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I do. And to tell you the truth, it's something that I don't think comes naturally for a lot of people. And I think a lot of decent managers will generally have to have some sort of background and training in, decision making and planning and how to actually conduct themselves. I think, stressful environments make people do different things to the way that they'd ordinarily carry themselves. So it's an interesting topic to talk about.
Yeah, I always find that people go into business not for it to go badly. And when we talk about managers and leaders, especially in big companies, their entire reason for being employed is to be successful, not to be there on the day that it all goes to clag and breaks.
Yeah.
So their entire focus, their entire journey to get to the point of success has been all about positive reinforcement.
That's right.
Rather than going backwards. So I find that the experience and exposure to really negative events is not actually that common.
No.
So being able to walk back and say, have you even been through a crisis?
No.
Believe it or not, there's people within business that haven't.
Right.
And so that's probably one of those big pieces from me about just the assumption that everybody can do it is incorrect.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that, right? Like, because we're very, very fortunate to live in the environment we do and operate in the economy, even though it's a little bit different at the moment. But you're right; everything's designed to go well.
Yeah.
And usually when the wheels start falling off, people don't know how to handle themselves. They don't know how to handle their team. And without some structure around it, it can definitely go bad.
So here's a question: do you think that many leaders just assume that they can do it?
I absolutely think that they do, yeah. And, whether that's personality aligned or not, it's I think they get really good at doing their job well when things are good.
Yeah.
But it does get very, very different as soon as things, people either start getting hurt, the operations get impacted and there's disruptions. They start to feel stress from external providers, upper management, media, whatnot. And all of that stress really makes people behave differently.
Yeah. And it's interesting when we talk about training, general management training, it's because the whole job is about success.
Yeah.
You would probably say that over 90% of all training for all executives and managers is about positive reinforcement again.
Yep. Absolutely.
And so that concept of people assume that because they've been through a course or they've been through training, that's actually the entire spectrum of what's required.
Yeah.
Without really thinking about these other pieces about, well, so what happens if it doesn't go that way?
Right.
I think is a really interesting piece to it. Let's stay just on that concept of people assuming that they can do it and moving forward. And then I'd like within today's episode to get to what are some of the things that we really see as benefits to preparing people and training people and exercising. But let's stay on where businesses are at the moment, because I think it goes to a broader problem of being complacent. And if everything's going well or you've dealt with smaller issues, and not crisis events, not things that impact by definition the viability, reputation, and objectives of the organisation.
Mm.
Like it might be that a couple of people got sick, or it might be that you had a slight downturn in your finances.
Mm.
That people believe that those one-offs are enough to be really confident to know how to respond when everything goes wrong. Have you got any thoughts on building complacency, or do you agree with that, or do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it's in terms of building complacency, I think that success can reinforce complacency.
Yeah.
Especially in good market conditions, in an industry or a sector that's booming. Things are really good. It generally builds complacency, and people don't necessarily think about what could go wrong.
Yeah, because success is a horrible teacher.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And this is the thing, right? Real growth only comes through discomfort.
Yeah.
And, whether or not we like to admit it, we always like to look on the positive side. You never really like to venture into the negative. But truth be told, the only way that you can grow and you can understand what could go wrong and how to behave and how to act in those times is when you do expose yourself to those, those negative impacts, those negative environments.
And that experience and exposure, I think counts for so much. And I would always go along the lines of the 70-20-10 rule. So 70% experience, 20% exposure, 10% education, like theory about what you're doing. Because just like, and I know you've got a services background like I do, that concept of, you can see it on a slide deck, you can see it in a classroom, but the difference between living it and learning from that stress is so much different.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think there's so many examples of how you actually learn more by doing, right? And every tradesperson I've ever spoken to, and me myself, you can learn as much as you want to in TAFE or tech or whatever, but then once you're on the job, you actually learn what it really takes. So I think, in terms of equipping managers and leaders for what happens in a crisis when things really do go wrong, it's not something that is generally taught or able to be taught in a classroom.
Yeah.
It really has to come through that exposure.
When we talk about then preparing organizations to build capability in disruption management, and that could be business continuity or it could be crisis management, we're often left to conduct training exercising only for senior executives. There's a massive gap there because often the detection of an event and the ability to get in front of a disruption is actually at the lowest level of a business.
Yep.
But there's very little awareness and there's very little training and capability at the lower levels. Is that a missed opportunity?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it's, it's something that is evident in every area of business, across all industries and sectors. Very rarely are the junior levels empowered or enabled through, robust training. It's generally once they show signs of potential and they get promoted and things like that, and then that is invested later on. And, if you look at crisis management, generally people think that a crisis can only be managed by upper levels of management. But as you pointed out, the people that are actually dealing with what is going on, the doers, implementing the strategies, the workarounds, they're the ones that are at the coalface.
And even the new 2022 Crisis Management International Standard states that a crisis management team should be supported by subordinate operational teams at different level.
Absolutely.
But we still seem to only be looking at that crisis management training capability. So understanding exactly within an organization who would respond and who needs to know how to respond and who to talk to is probably just as critical as the executive and potentially the board knowing what the end state needs to be.
Absolutely. And I think, exercising in general, especially for larger organizations, having all of those levels of management and staff involved can be costly. One of the best exercises that I ever worked on was in Sydney, and it was a scenario based around a plane crash into Barangaroo. And every single level of personnel from the emergency first responders all the way through to executive of Sydney Airport Corporation and Barangaroo Port Authority were all involved. And it was a huge exercise, but everyone got something out of it.
Well, I would put a sport analogy over that, and we hear a lot about smaller exercises, micro sims, etc., about building capability, building leadership, but you don't practice a football game by just doing the kickoff.
Correct.
And without that muscle memory across the entire organization of being able to go from the outset through to like, how is this going to be completed, with every aspect actually knowing how they're going to be able to work together. That doesn't build confidence just doing one part. It builds confidence when you're looking left and right and you're knowing as a leader who's next to you and what that looks like.
Right.
So that concept of end-to-end and holistic capability development, as well as bringing forward some of that capability from the lower levels and how that interacts, is going to give, in a disruption, the key leadership roles and responsibilities, not just the ability to understand their role better, but the confidence to know that capability is there when they need it.
Exactly right. And, I think one of the most important factors here is trust, right? So trust and respect is not automatic. It comes with shared experience. It comes with understanding that each person is competent, each person understands their role. And as we've sort of outlined earlier, in a crisis or a stressful environment, people's behavior changes. So how can you guarantee that you can trust and you can rely on that person either above you or below you if you haven't actually worked through a situation? And I think, in terms of those micro sims and things like that, they can be valuable. But like you've sort of outlined, you need to be able to exercise an entire scenario, because the initial reaction or the initial event and the initial response is just as important as the final response and going back to status quo.
You're taking us a really cool direction here about values and traits and leadership traits that may come to the fore in a crisis or a continuity scenario. I always like to tell clients these situations, especially true crisis situations, is where you do need to leave pride at the door. And based on how you've seen people respond under stress and pressure, if there is just if there's time pressure around there, is that right? Is this where you still need to have emotion in the room? There's varying opinions on this, and I don't know if there's a right answer, because it would always depend on the scenario and the
I think you're right. It definitely does depend on the scenario. From my point of view, an immersive experience will always get the best results, and sometimes defining best results is difficult also, because it might be how much that person has learned as a manager. It might also be how much they've learned as a person. But an immersive experience will definitely draw out more from what I believe than a simple time pressure situation. And the basis of the time pressure situation is to invoke a sense of stress, understand how people perform under stressful environments.
Because I think we do want people to be direct within a crisis response, within a disruption response. And if people can't handle that stress, I think one of the things I'd like people to take away from today's episode is it's actually okay to not include everybody in a response. Because certain people within an organization may not have the right traits, the capability, or even the capacity to operate at that level of heightened stress and tension, and it could actually cause more issues for the business and that individual if you expose them to that.
Absolutely.
And let's be really honest here, from not just our listeners, but across business here in Australia and globally, there's very few crisis situations that are going to be life and death.
Absolutely. And if they are potential life and death, then it's more than likely it's going to be escalated to such a stage where there's going to be a lot of interjections of capability. But I think you're right. I don't think everyone has got the capability or capacity in a stressful situation. And it takes a lot of courage for someone to stand up also and say, hey, I am not the right person to be in here at the moment.
Yep. And I think they have to. And that's that concept again that I said, leave pride at the door, not only for what you potentially want to achieve out of yourself, but also if you're not okay on that day, and we all have those days, are you actually impeding the response by being in that room? Like, can you step aside and let an alternate? And it comes back to the theme that we've had through this, which is having multiple people with multiple options, following that allowing an organization to know who are the people that they can call on to respond, to have an appropriate leadership response to any disruption.
Yeah.
Having the depth of capability becomes just so critical and important.
Yes, and I think there's a really good indicator of a strong leader when they're able to provide enough direction to their subordinate, whoever's working underneath them, and let them run with it.
Yeah.
Now, that comes back to trust and respect, shared experiences, understanding of capabilities. And I think if there's a leader that's able to do that, while they then go and do whatever's required of them, potentially up and out, crisis communications, speaking with government, all that sort of stuff, enabling whatever response is about to come, that's a really great trait of a good leader. Yeah.
Okay, so let's wrap up. When we're talking about leadership in disruption, can I put you on the spot and say, from a leader, from a manager that's put into a position of responsibility, is there a takeaway that you want to see? Like, if we're doing an exercise, is there something that you're looking for to say, that's what right looks like in terms of leadership in a disruption? And happy for you to ask me the same question.
Yeah, really good question. From my point of view, as a leader in an organization, it is your job to be able to empower and enable your subordinates to be able to do whatever they need to do, right? So if there's a crisis situation, if I'm the leader and I get notified of it, then I am going to try and draw out as much information as required so that then I can activate resources to support them. From there, I would go and then communicate. So I'd be looking for communication, both up and down and then out. What is that leader doing to enable and empower without getting their hands into it? So, nose out of the trough, and enabling the response. So, and from what would it be from your opinion?
I really think, I think you nailed it, that last part. I think the ability to retain perspective, to understand that as a leader in a boardroom for a business, that you are actually the one with time. So, completely agree with clear communication and clarity in that. So clear communication and sourcing the information to make those good decisions. And the last one is maintaining perspective. How do you take the breath and know that you've got time to be able to then make good decisions and look forward in the event, not just spin on the spot with what's impacting you at that point.
Right.
Okay, Will, thanks for that. That's an amazing discussion, one that I'm sure we'll continue in other aspects of the podcast when we go into more focus around training and exercising. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for listening to That Escalated Quickly.
Thanks very much.